Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and yeah, thanks, Joe. I mean, there were more sort of pearls of wisdom crammed into that 20 minutes than there certainly will be in mine, so I hope you wrote all of Joe's down. Yes, my job today is to introduce Biophilia, Biophilic Design, and nature indoors. So in terms of content for today, I present a bit of a sort of conundrum about things that we know, but we don't really know why, i.e., I'm a research scientist, I research manage, I'm kind of interested in evidence about why things happen and why we are drawn to do certain things. And biophilia has this really interesting aspect around the potential for this new interior landscape. But what evidence is there for it, of doing good? I'm also very interested in materials science and materials health. So I've looked a lot at some different materials, and I'll share a little bit of that with you today. And then really it is about these sort of simple, we're in the session where we're talking about simple practical things that you can do tomorrow almost in your office, certainly in terms of biophilia, about creating restorative, interesting, energizing, and critically human spaces. Of course, as the built environment, we focus an awful lot on our environmental sustainability, and we've seen how actually these things aren't in isolation, of course. And we focused a lot on our social sustainability, humans and the built environment, where things come from, who's making them, and that sort of social and community equity that is associated with the world that we accommodate. And today, of course, we're talking a lot more about our health and well-being. And there's a great website called Human Spaces, which has lots of kind of downloadable resources, certainly on biophilic design. And they did a worldwide study, but this just shows you for Europe that 42% of employees have no natural light at all, 55% no access to greenery, and poor old 7% of employees have no windows at all. So, you know, sounding a little bit familiar. Now, clearly, you know, just logic suggests that those are probably not great environments for us to be creating for people to operate in. And particularly when we think about nature as a whole. And if we take ourselves to the Far East briefly, and we look at something called Shirin-yoku, which is called forest bathing, this is something that Japanese medical practitioners prescribe to people with certain mental illnesses and conditions. It's literally the health and well-being value of getting outside, taking a walk through the forest. And there's a whole number of other benefits associated with that, but also it's one of these sort of things that edges us towards a little bit about biophilia and biophilic design and what it's telling us. So bearing in mind that we sort of get well where we're in nature, it's probably quite logical to think about bringing a bit of it indoors. Right, onto this conundrum about things we know but we don't really know why. Now here are some statements made by an extremely famous social reformer and statistician, a lady who was particularly concerned about medical healthcare and the well-being of patients. I'm not going to read them because I can't do the accent, but you can read them for yourself here. It really is quite interesting how she was making this connection between what she called fancies about beautiful objects, light and colour, having a positive and an actual physical effect on the recovery of patients in her care, and that they were actually responsible for an actual means of recovery. And of course, that very famous social reformer was a lady called Florence Nightingale. So this is in 1820 to 1850 that this was being discussed as the restorative properties associated with, let's just call them fancies. So how come our 21st century reality looks like this? 150 years later, now clearly we have lots of legacy issues about the building stock. We have lots of issues around priority and budgetary priority, and I don't need to tell you about the pressures on the NHS. There may well be the lack of evidence about the benefits of certain interventions, and also the significance of those impacts. And that's an area I'm particularly interested in, about building that evidence base. And the other thing that I have to introduce you to is something called the Savannah Principle. So an evolutionary psychologist, Kanazawa, in 2004, published his treatise on Savannah Principle. And this basically is suggesting that our psychology is still associated with early Homo sapiens, the ones that were evolving on the savannas in East Africa. And actually there's quite a good bit of logic in there as well. I mean, a lot of the things that we might think are, we kind of know, but we don't know why. How many of us in the room are afraid of spiders? Honesty, please. There's quite a few hands going on. This is one of these little evolutionary responses that actually has not changed a jot. All the spiders in Britain are completely harmless, but we still have that same reaction when we see one. So our psychology really is still on this amazing savannah. Now you can see a brilliant library building in the US that's kind of replicated this savannah kind of principle about views, open spaces, greenery and nature. And that brings us neatly onto biophilia, which is a hypothesis that humans are inextricably connected and have a tendency for natural forms and nature. First used by a German-born psychoanalyst, Erich Fromm, but popularised by a very eminent chap called Edward O. Wilson, a Harvard professor of biology, one of the world's leading authorities on social insects, multiple Pulitzer Prize-winning author, etc. The list goes on and on. And he essentially proposed our genetic connection to nature. We are humans, but we put ourselves in boxes for 90% of the time and isolate ourselves from nature. And that transitions quite nicely into something called biophilic design, which in its sort of basic format was talking about bringing trees and green spaces into our urban areas, like lovely Hyde Park here, and giving us a direct connection to nature, or perhaps bringing a natural element into an interior. I've got one of Paul's, where's Paul? I've got one of his pot plants here that he had in his office. So those kind of two fundamental principles. But of course it's deeply more complex than that. It is about visual connection to nature and this non-visual connection. There's something called non-rhythmic sensory stimuli, which is a bit of a mouthful. But essentially, when you're outside, that's happening all the time. There are changes in air currents, you're hearing different sounds, your periphery vision is picking up different things, sounds, smells, all sorts of things. So there's lots about non-rhythmic sensory stimuli. Access to thermal and airflow variability, the presence of water, dynamic and diffuse daylight. Daylight really, really is such a fundamental cornerstone of biophilia. And obviously connection with natural systems. So here we are. If we looked, oh dear, my words have gone a bit wrong. Sorry about that. If we look across the whole sort of gamut of what biophilia is, you're right to sort of jump in with our plants and our nature. That's the most sort of accessible, immediate element. But actually, fish tanks are pretty good too, but we don't often think about those. We've spoken about sounds. You'll see certainly in Gatwick Airport and numbers of other different locations that they're using soundscapes now to calm people down. And that's everything from bird song to water noises. There's textures, there's colour palettes that are associated with nature that you won't find certain colours in nature. The point about air is certainly connected to that variation in airflow as well as the quality of that air. And again, straight from nature, there's things around aesthetic and around diversity. If I reflect on the office that I'm in at BRE, it's a fairly regimented environment. Somebody somewhere has said, how many desks can we cram into this space? That was the equation that was used. It wasn't about, well, let's make it into different zones and think about the variety of tasks that are going on. Some of the conversations we've been having already today. And then critically as well, there's one over there on the right-hand side, which is the view. What do we see from our windows? That has a huge effect on the way we behave. And then you'll see right in the middle there is light. So natural light and daylight, fundamentally important. And the reality is, the evidence is there from offices, so workers in office environments with natural elements, such as daylight and greenery, 15% increase in reported levels of well-being, 6% more productive and 15% more creative. And that's before we even go into the depths of the reduction in absentee levels associated with those environments. Plenty of studies in healthcare as well around the recovery of patients recovering quicker, requiring less medication, going home and released from hospital sooner. And even in some cases, patients feeling less pain, which is quite interesting. The evidence from schools in learning environments is huge, often tasked as a pyramid of benefits associated with the students themselves and the staff, but obviously the system and the economy benefits from that as well. Children learning faster with natural light present, improved spelling and performance in maths and other subjects where plants are present, And then if you start putting a lot of these things together and putting in green walls or acoustics and maybe natural materials, you're getting, again, reduced absentee levels per pupil per year. So some really quite positive evidence coming from schools. And there's thousands of case studies of this. Just go online, look at that Human Spaces website. Whether you're in a hospital in Sydney that has, I'd love to go here, a full-scale atrium aquarium in there. You can just see the edge of it here in part of the children's ward, where they've used lots of different sort of biophilic elements that you can see up here around colour palette and zoning and diversity. A bit closer to home in Cranfield University in the Water Sciences Department. Again, it's zoning, natural light, perspective and view within the building. This point about, we've heard a lot about this point about people bumping into each other and collaborating and sharing. Hugely important. There's that school I had a picture of up earlier. That's in Oxfordshire, so again, a little bit nearer to home. Natural light, acoustic panels, it's this huge blurring. It happens to be in a beautiful location, of course, which they've hugely made benefit of. This blurring of the indoors and the outdoor spaces, and the use of wood as well. And then various commercial towers being built in Wickham Street in Brisbane. Wellbeing is right at the core of the design going in here around open meeting areas, views, greenery, and a nature-like diversity. That's one thing I'd really like you to take away. Nature is not uniform and regulated. Diversity. As I mentioned, I'm quite interested in materials. There's a material called wood that's been appreciated for millennia, but actually it's a natural material, it's naturally variable, and all sorts of other things. And they can play really quite an interesting role as a proxy for nature in interiors in buildings as well, through variation in colour and texture and natural form. So we've been doing some research that is starting to suggest that it's mirroring the benefits associated with having, fantastic views out your windows and plants inside your building, that if you have interior wood, you also get some of those benefits. And I'll come on to that in a moment. A very famous university, UBC in Vancouver, has been doing a lot of work around refitting different rooms with materials and looking at how those have an impact on the perceptions of the users, in this case particularly offices. And wood had a very striking effect in that case around lowering this sympathetic nervous system activation, which is responsible for our psychological stress responses. We've been doing some work with a Scandinavian consortia looking at interior wood and the characteristics linked to interior comfort in building. And again, this is kind of going a bit beyond perhaps where we are now, but all materials have really rather interesting qualities and properties, and many of them are hidden, and we don't think of them in a sort of health and well-being context. For example, this is wood being deployed in a supermarket chain in Norway, and its principal role there is not, to look amazing and to look natural, but it's actually acting as a hygrothermal mass within that environment. So the wood is absorbing and releasing moisture peaks that happen during the day, and also absorbing and reducing the thermal peaks that happen during the day. So that's actually managing a problem they were having with their indoor air humidity, and they can actually now reduce the usage of their MVHR units. So there's some really quite interesting hidden qualities of materials. And in that same program, we're looking at obviously the perceptions of changing. We're trying to build a bit more sort of European evidence, if you will, around some of those perception studies of changing materials in buildings. And again, there seem to be some quite interesting and positive features coming out. So really, what can we do now using biophilia to improve health and well-being? So we're in the final third of our day about practical interventions. Well, clearly, if we can bring natural elements into our indoor environment, that would be very positive. I would suggest actually have a look at what you're doing already, because you might well be doing things that are broadly biophilic within that, about the diversity of design and layout and colour usage. Look at product selection and make sure again that product selection has a little bit of thinking about biophilic engaged with it, because actually you could be gaining benefit there without adding a single penny of cost. Just thinking about the colour and the texture and the pattern of some systems that you put within your building. And I've just thought of an example there. So a floor covering, and we look at we've got a fairly sort of regulated floor covering here. Clearly functional requirements around durability, wear resistance, cost, ease of cleaning and all those things. But what about those other features? Well, okay, we've got colour, we've got odour, we've got emissions, we've got particulates coming from the carpet, the texture. There's a whole bunch of things in there that we should be considering as well that impact on this biophilic design elements. And then how it features in that design around others, as others have said, this key thing around layout, zoning and diversity within the working environment. And just to give you an example, this is a sort of a not untypical 1980s cellular office building here on the right-hand side. And typically when it gets refurbished, this kind of thing happens on the left-hand side. So it gets opened up a little bit, so our perspective and view changes, which is great. And for those that are wondering, we're not in Cat A territory here. This is definitely Cat B. So we've opened things up a bit. We've certainly had to put a new carpet down. We've had to paint the walls, and we've probably upgraded the lighting to whatever the industry standard is. And pretty much every refurbishment will have to do that. So there are 3 simple choices there: floor, wall, light. All those have biophilic qualities associated with them. And you can make an informed biophilic choice about those 3 features you would do anyway. So in terms of what we can do now, you're pretty unlikely to be able to change the view from your window unless you have some kind of superpowers that are just beyond my recognition. Thermal and airflow diversity is tricky. It's not impossible, but it is tricky. And it's pretty unlikely you're going to install a major water feature within your office as well. That's probably not going to get the approvals. You may well be able to change that view and perspective internally, open up, take a few walls out. You may well install human-centric circadian rhythm lighting. That's eminently possible. And build in some acoustic controls as well. But those 4 things down there you could certainly do. You can certainly think about colour. You can certainly bring some plants, that point of nature, or maybe a fish tank if you prefer, into your environment. You can think about the zoning of space for the tasks that are needed. And you can certainly think about how texture plays a role in defining those zones. I've been given the 5-minute warning a minute ago, so I did actually have a slide for those that haven't seen that wonderful slide of BRE and I know, it has been mentioned a few times. And that's great, and that's really progressive, this kind of streamlining process that's going on, very mature attitude. But equally, I think, and Joe mentioned it a couple of times, and others have as well, there's a whole bunch of other stuff as well. And I don't think it's all done, quite frankly. I think there's still quite a lot of questions that need to be answered. So we're putting together a biophilic office refurbishment project, really to grow and deepen the evidence base within the UK and Europe for the health and well-being and productivity impacts of refurbishment within the office environments. And effectively what we're doing on our site, we've got a large office that's being refurbished. We'll be measuring the physiological and psychological well-being of 50 office occupants pretty much over 2 years, so a year prior to refurbishment and then intervening at different levels and then measuring again. We're working with a number of partners, but very keen to hear from new ones as well, because the project is not done yet. We are beginning in July. But it really is important from my perspective in research that we continue to build that evidence and to challenge how we can improve the health and well-being within our office environments and refurbishments. So the sort of questions that we're keen to answer are: what are those practical interventions that those Cat B offices in Middlesbrough can deploy now? Can those be quantified as part of the decision-making process? Let's hope that's a yes. Can the products used in those refurbishments have a health and well-being potential associated with them? We're going to hear about VOCs shortly. What other things might we need to attach to products to think about health and well-being, and to provide some practical guidance. But really it is to start answering that why question. There's a lot of things we know, but we don't know why. I don't know why. When I go into a room and I see a beautiful polished wooden table, I have to go up and stroke the surface of it. I don't know why I do it. I think I'm probably not alone in this. And then tap on it, but we do. And it really is about evidence building. And it's to move away, of course, from what is unfortunately, the overwhelming industry standard in our office environments to create more positive, energising and restorative environments. Thank you very much.